Welcome back to Poll 2 PPE. How do societies and economies interact? And this week we'll be looking at classical political economy. You've got several texts to read to support this week's explorations, available on the library's reading list for this subject. Have a good look at the picture that I've selected to accompany this week's reflections. So it's a sketch of agriculture in 1860. We can see capital in the form of machinery to till the fields with. We can see labour, human capital. And we've got land, so we've got the factors of production for agriculture here. And this is what classical political economy will be concerned with. How to produce wealth by improving agricultural production and the very nascent forms of industry that are only just beginning to occur. We haven't yet seen the Industrial Revolution. That will come later in the 19th century. What we've got in Britain at this time are agrarian modes of production. We've also got starvation and impoverishment. And so the classical political economists will be interested to try to understand how to improve agricultural production in an agrarian economy. And they'll also be wanting to improve how to distribute agrarian production among the people. So let's look at our lecture plan for today. So as I mentioned last week, we'll be taking an approach that looks at the problem to which our thinkers were responding. We'll look at how they responded in terms of their methodologies and theories and their policies for what should be done. And we'll also bring critical considerations to bear on their responses. So in the first part of the lecture, we'll look at how these classical political economists define their problem. And we'll see that, broadly speaking, they conceptualize their problem as impoverishment in an agrarian and semi-feudal economy. So Adam Smith saw this as a problem of mercantilism, where the power of the merchants was undermining wealth production. Merchants were securing an economic system, changes to the production of wealth, which was to their benefit, as opposed to the benefit of other types of workers in the economy. So Ricardo thought that it wasn't just that a problem with mercantilism, but also a problem with the remnants of feudalism. So the Corn Laws for Ricardo was the problem. These were tariffs and other restrictions on imported grains. And these, he felt, worked to benefit the landowners, undermining widespread wealth production. So the broader problem was how to increase the production of wealth by undermining those elements of a mercantile system that were less than ideal, and by trying to redesign the economic system so that landowners didn't have exorbitant power over agrarian workers. And a reverend in the Church of England, Thomas Robert Malthus, conceptualised the problem similarly, but put it in terms of how to manage impoverishment and the inability of agricultural workers in an agrarian economy to adequately sustain themselves. So we see overlapping and intersecting views by the classical political economists about what the problem is. As for the response that each economist develops, we'll see that each of them propose ways to improve agrarian production, Malthus considers that the solution to poverty will be a self-limiting population, limited by the constraints of what agriculture can produce. So Adam Smith sees that the solution will lie in improving the division of labour in agriculture and in emerging industries. He'll also want to propose improvements to distribution. These improvements will concern the extent of the market, and he'll be defending larger, freer markets. There'll be similarities and differences in Ricardo. Ricardo really focuses on the problem of the Corn Laws, and so his solution is to really abandon those tariffs on importing grains, because he thinks this will prevent profits from disproportionately accruing to landowners in the form of rent. And this will allow the benefits of the production of wealth to be enjoyed more broadly. Malthus, his solution was economic liberalism and overturning the forms of poverty relief that was provided to families under the rubric of the old poor laws provided in parishes. His solution, as we'll see, will be really the self-regulation of population limited by agricultural production. Now, for me, this is a kind of euphemism for letting the poor starve, although there are nuances in his argument. We'll see that some people took this up. The Poor Law Commissioners, the people who wrote the commissioners who wrote the report on the Poor Laws in 1830, drew on Malthus to advocate for changes to the old Poor Laws. They believed that the new Poor Laws should require poor relief in workhouses and not poor relief in parishes distributed through charity. So we'll then look at critical considerations, and we'll ask those three key questions. Who wins? Who loses? And does it matter? And we'll try and point out that really if the winners were once the merchants and the landowners, the new winners also have implications for who loses. I want you to have a think about who you think are the winners and the losers with these new forms of, new ideas of classical political economy, and whether you think it matters. So again, to summarise, just so it's very clear what approach we're taking in every week of this subject, we'll modify Frank Stillwell's approach to suit our own objectives, and we'll feature the following: the problem. What are the real world problems that economists were trying to answer during different historical periods? What were their response? How did economists explain these problems with methodologies, allowing theories? And how did they propose to overcome these problems with concrete policies? What policies did they propose? And we'll consider their responses critically. Who gains and who loses by the new versions of economics? Should this matter to us? And what elements of the approach might we want to reconsider? This period is a time of economic change. And what we see at this time in which the classical political economists are writing and thinking, we see a rise in the power of the mercantile class as feudal economies break down, as more people are beginning to live in emerging cities, the first towns of their nature. We also see the continued power of the landowning class, the remnants of feudalism. Adam Smith will primarily target the power of the merchants, and Ricardo will primarily target the power of the landowning class. The backdrop to this is starvation. Starvation of the agrarian poor families who had difficulty finding enough food to eat and putting bread on the table. So this is the problem of this period. So to understand the context for the emergence of classical political economy in this period, we need to briefly understand the relationship between feudalism and mercantilism, two very different ways of thinking about how to structure economic activity. So feudalism was based on a hierarchy of inherited obligations based on birth. Serfs had obligations to the lord of the manor by means of being born into a serf household. This system of reciprocal obligations and duties meant that the lord of the manor needed to protect the serf from the threat of violence from other manors or other serfs, and the lord needed to administer justice, a sort of feudal justice. In response, the serf was obliged to pay the lord from the surplus product of the land. Now, over time, over a very long course of time and subject to a number of changes that took place that I won't be able to recount here, it so happened that serfs began to be able to be liberated from these obligations gradually. And so serfs were able to access a greater surplus product than expected through, for example, the three-field rotation system, which produced more. And this increased surplus product meant that they could pay back part of their obligations in advance and ultimately liberate themselves from the obligations to pay a tithe to the lord of the manor. And again, due to a range of factors that I, again, can't do justice to here, merchants, an emerging mercantile class, came about both because of this liberation of this new type of class from the hierarchy of feudal obligations, and because those liberated from these obligations sought creative ways to produce. The merchant class was not part of the feudal hierarchy. This development specified a very different way of organising economic activity. So workers who were previously in the feudal system were now able to be put to work in putting out workshops where merchant ships would go out from Britain to the colonies and bring back raw materials. Cotton, for example. And these raw materials would be brought back by the merchant ships to workers who were previously agricultural workers, who were now working in workshops, making these raw materials into finished products through hand looms and things like that for a wage. This is the birth of the merchant period, or mercantilism, and it reflects the breakdown of feudalism. So what are the basic tenets of mercantilism? And this is what Adam Smith will reject. He'll be wanting to reject this competing approach, this mercantile approach, and provide a different way, another different way of thinking about economic activity. Well, and again, these tenets of mercantilism are really based on the mercantile system being a system of trade based on the colonies, taking goods and raw materials from the colonies and bringing them back to the core European and British nations, where in Britain the workshops would work that raw material into finished products, creating consumers in the colonies and exporting those finished products back out, not just to domestic markets, but also to markets in the colonies. So what are the tenets? Well, it's state-focused, at least in theory, and the idea is to increase state power. There is an assumption that total wealth is static. That's an odd conception, given that we think that we can increase gross domestic product and so forth, and increase production globally as well. But at this time, wealth was viewed as unchangeable and subject to transfer. It was conceptualized as gold and silver stores, and since these were viewed as limited, it meant that wealth was always going to be obtained at somebody else's expense. This is the time, by the way, in which the Spanish ships would seek gold off the coast of Africa and bring it back to the home nation. It was a time of piracy. The view was that the nation should really be trying to sell more to foreigners, to foreign states, to people in the colonies, or to people in other European nations. And the nation, the British nation, should be selling more to foreigners than it bought. One wouldn't want to be giving more coin to another country than one had in the home country. By selling more to foreigners than it bought, the idea was that Britain would be able to transfer wealth back to the home country, according to the mercantile view. And so the implications of this was that subsidies would be needed to prop up domestic industry, the working of raw goods into finished products. Domestic industry was very important. The idea was to export domestic products to the colonies and to other European nations and to other countries for coin, so that Britain was able to increase its own gold and silver stores. Tariffs were also used to discourage imports. Of course, one didn't want to have to pay for imports with coin, because this would again relinquish those valuable and limited stores of gold and silver. There were actually laws to require the consumption of British goods in the colonies. The Sugar Act of 1764, for example, was to force colonies to produce such goods. So colonies became major consumers of British produced goods. The colonies became a way of permitting producers to find new markets for their products. So every bit of the country's soil, too, it was thought, should be used for agriculture, mining, or manufacturing. And this is again because if one could produce those raw materials oneself, one would no longer have to pay and relinquish gold and silver stores. Again, the implication is that all raw materials in a country are also to be used in domestic manufacture. Finished goods have a higher value than raw materials. So Britain wasn't really interested in exporting raw materials to another country to be finished off there, to be produced in workshops in another country. It was important that the putting out workshops where people were creating the finished goods from raw materials actually be situated on British soil. So really it meant that raw materials really should be primarily generated at home, in the home country. Only in cases where certain imports were indispensable and unavailable, like tea imported by the East India Company, were there to be exceptions made. Only in those cases should they be obtained from beyond the core nation. And you really wanted to be only bringing back the raw goods to be finished, or to be made into finished products in the home country. And you wanted to be trying to exchange those other goods for other domestic goods, not for gold and silver. One didn't want to pay coin for those products. So then, really, imports should really be confined, according to this theory, only to the raw materials that can then be finished off at home, and only to those raw materials that can't be made by Britain itself. So we can see that the mercantile economic system, in its emergence from feudalism, can be considered as a precursor to capitalism, because it rationalised the economy into profit and loss. Even if it didn't really yet view wealth as unlimited in principle, which is what a capitalist system now does. And that's really something that Adam Smith will bring into the equation. Wealth, for Adam Smith, should not be viewed as unchangeable and subject to transfer. Adam Smith thinks that that idea is wrong. He thinks that the production of wealth is limited only by the extent of the market. So if you can find a market for a good thing, you can produce more wealth. It's unlimited. It's limited only by the wants and desires of people, and these can be subject to change. So for Adam Smith, a really key and crucial 18th century thinker, the problem really was mercantilism. Merchants were undermining the widespread production of wealth. The broader problem really was about how to increase the production of wealth and its distribution among people. And he's explicitly critical of how merchant interest groups were acting as forms of monopolies, trying to impose restrictions on the importation of goods so that they themselves could benefit, given their own material interests in producing domestic produced products themselves and exporting them to the colonies and to other European nations. Adam Smith was also quite insistent in his view that merchant interest groups were able to have a formidable interest on Parliament and upon many occasions intimidate the legislature. Members of Parliament were giving in to intimidation, he thought, because they wanted to secure their reputation with the powerful, the merchants, and to avoid the abuse and insults that arise when monopolistic interests are disappointed. So how does Adam Smith respond? Well, he responds with a very different theory of the relationship between economies and societies. And that's our topic, isn't it, in this subject? Adam Smith thinks that the economic welfare depends first on the amount of annual produce of a labour or nation. This is something that Stilwell draws attention to in the opening blurb that introduces your readings this week. Classical political economy, he notes, is defined by a labour theory of value rather than what later becomes a theory of price. We're getting ahead of ourselves a little bit. We'll study the labour theory of value in the week on Marxian political economy. But what's important here is that economic welfare depends on the amount of annual produce of labour of a nation. It is that which labour produces. So labour in tilling the land produces something. Labour in erecting a fence produces something. Labour by milking a cow. We can see all the various types of labour that go into agrarian production as the picture depicted on the opening slide. As for the concept of annual produce of labour of a nation, this is what we now refer to, at least in a general way, as gross national product, GNP, or gross domestic product, GDP. And for Smith, this depends on the extent of the market, how large the market is. But economic welfare doesn't just depend on how much is produced by labour. It's also dependent on the number of those who are consuming this produce, because if only a few people consume this produce, then welfare is not going to be particularly high for those who don't, even if overall the produce of labour increases. Again, this is a very different conception of wealth to the static conception of mercantile wealth as limited stores of gold and silver which can't be changed and which should be held by the nation. So Smith really wanted to liberate the market from the constraints and protections of the mercantile approach, tariffs on imports, the propping up of domestic industry through subsidies and so forth. And he thought that this should allow for rapid increases in the levels of overall wealth if we reconceptualise wealth in this way, as the amount of annual produce of a nation and not in terms of gold and silver stores. So you can see how this is very much leading into concepts that we still use today. And you can see why Adam Smith is very much the poster boy for economic liberalism and free markets, even if his thinking is much more complex than that and not always amenable to a free market approach. So the third idea that Adam Smith brings in is that the number of those who consume is dependent on two factors. And this is where we lead into the reading that you will have read for today, or are reading now, to support this exploration. And the two factors that can increase the number of those who consume are as follows. It's reliant on the skill, dexterity, and judgment with which labour is applied, and the proportion between the number of those employed and those who are not so employed. The text that you have to read today is really just dealing with 3A, skill, dexterity and judgment with which labour is applied. And the idea is if we use labour skillfully, with dexterity and with good judgment, we can increase the produce of labour. We haven't yet got in your texts that you're required to read an account of how the proportion between the number of those employed and not so employed is going to be increased. The reading just focuses on 3A, but I wanted to draw your attention to the fact that really it's also 3B that's very important for Adam Smith. So those are the key ideas that Adam Smith wants to bring to the table that are very different to a mercantile theory of wealth. So then Adam Smith investigates these three ideas more closely, and he asks, how do we improve labour productivity? He thinks that the cause of the greatest improvement in the productive powers of labour is also the cause of the dramatic increase in the skill, dexterity and judgment. And this is the case even in a discipline like philosophy, and I'll mention this in a moment. The cause of this greatest improvement is for him the division of labour. Division of labour in any use of labour. So when you divide labour and when you specialise in the area or the task that your labour is devoted to, you can improve that task. The idea is improve how you do that task, improve what you produce. Dividing labour can improve productivity because it allows you to increase your skill and dexterity in that particular labour task. It provides savings in time because you don't have to then swap between tasks. And it allows you to invent capital stocks and machines to improve the production in that task as well. Let's provide an example that Adam Smith provides. He asks about the production of a pin and notes that it involves so many different tasks that one person would be at pains to produce one a day, and then absolutely produce no more than a maximum of 20, even if they were the most efficient person who ever existed. But by dividing the task into smaller motions, smaller jobs, with one person to straighten out the metal, to sharpen the point, and so forth, workers can have a production line that can produce thousands in a day. And this division of labour can also improve by producing savings in time, because you don't have to move between jobs. Labourers can be a bit lazy and want to dilly-dally between jobs. And so when you move from one task to another, then you can be less efficient in your use of time. Of course, he's really talking about male labour during this period, and also child labour. There were women later on in the industrial period, obviously, in factories. And of course, there were always women doing household work and working in fields and so forth. But this is something we'll discuss later too. So savings in time, because the worker will saunter between their different jobs and waste time. So the idea is that if you're just focusing on one task repetitively, you don't waste that time. And the division of labour can then increase the invention of capital stock and machines. And workers themselves will be responsible for inventing good machines because they know how to improve their tasks Once machine makers begin to have that technical expertise, they too will be able to improve machines too, beyond what one would have expected. So the division of labour can then lead to the more efficient development of the very machines designed to improve the division of labour. Finally, he considers what the principle is that gives rise to this division of labour. Is it benevolence? Is it because we care about each other that we want to do better and produce more? Asks Adam Smith. He says no, it's self-interest, it's self-love. It's the desire to trade, to barter, to improve how many things one can make in an hour, so as to get higher profit margins. The propensity to truck, as he puts it. And so here again we have the birth of a very modern idea of self-interest being at the very heart of economic activity. He even sees, and he says this explicitly, he even sees a discipline like philosophy as improving through specialisation. PPE students might find this interesting because you've been studying philosophy not on its own, but in its interrelationship with a study of the political institutions that regulate behaviour, and also competing ways of thinking about the organisation of societies around economic interests and incentives. Adam Smith thinks that if we do philosophy by focusing just on a particular task like epistemology, the study of knowledge, or moral philosophy, we will be able to do this better. To be honest, I'm not convinced by this. I think a lot is lost by the specialisation in a domain of critical thinking like philosophy, which would do so much better by being interdisciplinary and not so specialised. And that's why I really do love the degree PPE, where you get to look at competing disciplinary perspectives on the topics that you're studying. Returning to Smith, what are the natural limits of the division of labour, he asks? Well, the division of labour is limited by the market. And this really entails a defence of global markets as opposed to local mercantile protections of domestic markets. So really, the Brits were wrong to want to stop imports and to boost exports. And that's interesting because we still have this idea today of exports being good and imports being less good, at least sometimes. Adam Smith says that's misguided, that's mercantilism. And the Spaniards were wrong to send their ships out to the African coastlines and procure as much gold as they could, because wealth really wasn't about unchanging stores of gold and silver. It was really about something else. The production of the things that people want through their labour. And this could be, according to Adam Smith, unlimited. And it could be promoted by the division of labour. So the division of labour in large markets is going to be better than in small, because large markets increase the possibility of exchange and increase the desire to specialise. We also see that this is linked to a defence of towns rather than countries, marketplaces around towns, around emerging industries, around transport, the need for transport to expand markets and so forth. This is how we extend markets beyond the nation state, and where the nation state becomes less important than the infrastructure of large markets. We also have in Adam Smith's work a further point about the state. If what's important now is the infrastructure and activities in large global markets and no longer in domestic economies, then we need to reconceptualise the role of the state. And he thinks that the sovereign's duties should be limited to those duties that are required to secure the good functioning of markets. And this involves three duties. First, defence against other nations. the duty of protecting society from the violence and invasion of other independent societies. This is important to secure markets. Second, administering courts of law, the duty of protecting as far as possible every member of society from injustice or oppression of every other member of it. And the duty to establish an exact administration of justice, because if you make a contract with somebody to exchange a market good and don't uphold it, then the trust on which market exchange relies is undermined, which leads markets to falter. So contract law is very important for Adam Smith. And then we have the maintenance of non-profitable public works for Smith. This is really about erecting and maintaining those public works and public institutions that are also market promoting. For example, it might not be in the interest of any individual to erect and maintain roads or schools, but these are very important for increasing distribution of goods, allowing markets to be larger than they were before, and improving the human capital skills that are going to be important to markets, for education at least. And so that, in a nutshell, is Adam Smith's account of the problem, namely that mercantile monopolies or the interests of the merchant class were really undermining the conditions for the production of wealth, and they'd misunderstood the nature of wealth, really because they were serving their own interests. So he developed a different theory of production, which he felt would really promote the ability of people to improve the annual produce of labour of a nation. And that's the solution for him, a proper understanding of wealth and its production, and promoting that by removing those barriers to production that mercantile economies had instituted. So now we can turn to David Ricardo. David Ricardo's view of the problem is not so much mercantilism, but really he focuses on the remnants of feudalism, the power of the landowning class. And he focuses in particular on the Corn Laws. So this is a time at which mercantile economies were emerging, right? At the same time as we have remnants of the feudal economies also exerting their power over legislation and interests and parliament. So the Corn Laws were brought in 1815, and they were in place between 1815 and 1846. And they involved tariffs and other restrictions. It wasn't really just corn, it was grains too, like wheat, barley and other foodstuffs out of which you could make bread. And the Corn Laws really placed these restrictions and tariffs on the importation of any of these grains, bread-making grains. Of course, there are links here with mercantilism, right? The idea is, in the spirit of mercantilism, that these goods, these foodstuffs, should not be imported from other countries, but should be made at home in Britain. But Ricardo also wants to argue that the Corn Laws were actually favouring the landowners, not just the mercantile class, but the landowners too. These remnants of feudalism, the landowners. He published his book called Essay on the Influence of a Low Price of Corn, and it showed the inexpediency, the inefficiency of restrictions on importation. He published this book in 1815 when the Corn Laws were introduced, and it was an immediate success overnight. It sold out and they needed to run another print run. It was controversial too, of course. Interestingly, it was the merchants who were buying it, the emerging merchants, those who would become the bourgeois capitalists when the Industrial Revolution takes off in the next century. And it was the merchants who bought the book. Why? Well, David Ricardo was actually defending an argument that they particularly liked. And this was that the Corn Laws should not be brought in because they favoured and exclusively favoured the landowners, and they were really to the disadvantage even of the merchants. So although we might think that the importation, the tariffs on the importation of grains is a mercantile law because according to mercantilism, Britain wants to be producing these goods themselves. Ironically, the merchants themselves recognised that it wasn't even in their own interests to do that, because this law was going to favour the landowners, the remnants of feudalism. So mercantile laws were not even favouring the merchants here, but rather these remnants of feudalism, the landowners. So drawing on Terry Peach, one can summarise the argument as follows. If one assumes an economy that's mercantile, that's closed to the importation of foreign corn, then as the population grows, there'll be an increasing demand for corn. And this demand for corn can only be satisfied either by more intensive cultivation of land that's already being used for agriculture, or by cultivating land that hasn't yet been used. So the idea was that the restrictions on importing grains was really an incentive to open up new land that had not yet been used for the production of those grains. But of course, any land that hasn't yet been used was going to be less fertile, or it was going to be less advantageously situated. Otherwise, it would have already been opened up. It might be rocky. It might be on a hilly surface. There were reasons why it hadn't been cultivated yet, and other parts of Britain had already been cultivated. It might be far from transport to the city. It might incur large transportation costs, reducing the profit margins for producers, for agricultural farmers. So if one assumes an economy that's closed like the mercantile one, then this increasing demand for corn by a larger population can really only be satisfied in those ways, by increasing the intensity of cultivation on land that's already been opened up for agriculture, or by opening up new land that's really not as productive, not as fertile, not as nicely located as land that's already been opened up. And this means that the expansion of output, more corn, will permit only diminishing returns. That means it will allow for the production of grain, but not in so productive a way. It will produce less grain for the amount of land that's being tilled. Diminishing returns. So profits will be lower, profit margins will be lower, because the capital that is used to cultivate less fertile land will be still the same or even more intense because of the difficulties involved, but the output will be less because it's rocky. So you really need to work harder for less. And also, if the land hasn't been opened because of transportation costs, your profit margins go down too. So it means that this capital, this human labour, machineries, the ploughs that you saw in the opening slide, all of that, all of these factors of agricultural production, they could actually be better put to use on other land, or simply by not making more machinery for farming, but making machinery for the production of other goods, industries, eventually machines to produce the cotton goods in Lancashire and Manchester. And this would mean really importing corn rather than trying to produce it domestically. The argument that you need to read for this week focuses on Ricardo's account of rent. And it may seem a little inaccessible at the start, but I've tried to present it here in a more intuitive manner. We've seen on the previous slide that the Corn Laws were what Ricardo was objecting to. He felt that the Corn Laws would lead to a situation in which landowners were encouraged then, because there was no importation of grain, to open up less fertile areas of land and rent them to farmers. So this argument by Ricardo about rent supports his view that the Corn Laws should be rejected. And this is why his book became a success. Because even though the introduction of imports on grain seemed to be consistent with a mercantile view of the economy, it was clear that they were going to primarily favour the landowning class and not the merchants at all. And this is why his book became such a success, because it seemed to suggest that really it was the landowners who would benefit. Obviously, the landowners had a lot of power still, and that is why his work was very controversial. So how did the landowners benefit the most from closed markets? Well, Ricardo argued that landlords will charge farmers rent equivalent to the difference between, on the one hand, the amount at which farmers will still be interested in farming, and on the other hand, the value of the total output that's produced. So farmers will be producing from the land an output that's going to be equal to the cost paid to capital, including farm equipment, machinery, and labour. Land too. They'll need to pay a rent for land, and rent should not exceed the amount that farmers would be interested in farming at. And this must be given by the value of the total output that's produced. But then Ricardo goes on to argue, well, landlords are really only going to be able to do this if there are no imports to prevent them from continuing to open up this less profitable land. Only having no imports of grain allow landowners to fix the rent in the way that I've just described in the first point on the slide. And so that means, and this is the most important point, it is primarily, according to Ricardo's argument, landlords that are going to disproportionately benefit from closed markets, from tariffs on the importation of grain. Because it's this tariff on the importation of grain that allows them to fix rents in this manner to their own benefit. As for Ricardo's solution, well, this is quite clear. He thought that the corn laws should be abolished. If imports of corn were available from other foreign countries, from foreign entities, then capital could actually be used in different ways. Labour could be used in ways that didn't suffer from those diminishing returns that we spoke about earlier. And that's really his argument in a nutshell. His solution really is the abolishment of the corn laws. Ironic, really, because the importation on the tariffs on imported goods were really consistent with the mercantile economy. So Ricardo's solution, criticising the way that this mercantile solution could benefit landowners, really constituted a criticism of the mercantile economy itself, leading him to be more similar to Adam Smith in Smith's advocacy of a larger market without tariffs. Now, the corn laws did not get abolished until well after his death, a good 20 years after Ricardo's death. And this shows the power that the landowners had in the political institutions of the time. It wasn't until 1846 that the corn laws were overcome. The monopoly of landowners, as well as the monopoly of merchants, were real impediments to change. And in this case, interestingly enough, the monopoly of merchants wasn't enough to contest the power of the landowners. Okay, so now we're going to, so what we've done is we've looked at two problems. We've looked at Adam Smith's account of the problem with the monopolies of the merchant class, and we've looked at Ricardo's account of the problems of the monopoly of the landowning class a remnant from feudalism. And we've seen how both of them advocate for solutions that are inconsistent with the idea of a mercantile economy, a mercantile political economy. Wealth is conceptualized not as static, but as able to be unlimited in its growth, dependent solely on the extent of the market and upon the desires and wants of those who would like to buy and sell. So now we can turn to Thomas Robert Malthus, who was a reverend with the Church of England, and he was concerned to look at the relation between population, agricultural production and poverty. So he'd seen populations starve through the inaccessibility of food. He'd seen famine, and he wanted to understand why impoverishment existed. Although he does provide a moral argument for this, people working in demography and population studies now refer to Malthus as the first modern thinker of population. He argues that agricultural production will only increase at modest rates, and we've seen why. Production is limited by the inability to open up as fertile land as before. So we have to move to less fertile land and less accessible land. And this means that the capacity for increases in agricultural production are actually modest. It increases, but it doesn't increase a lot. In the best case scenario, Malthus says, looking at trends in production over previous historical periods, we can see that even in the best case scenario, we only see the addition of one output of production over 25 years. Now, in this table that I've provided you with, you can see it provides a comparison with arithmetic accounts of production and geometric accounts of population. Geometric are exponential based on a ratio. Arithmetic is really the difference between two consecutive terms when that difference is constant. So we can see in the graph the idea that social wealth production is increasing by 1 unit in each period, let's say over 25 years, that's production. But we can see that population is actually geometric. We've got an exponential growth in population. And Malthus thought that the statistics, a statistical analysis of population showed that really the capacity for having children of people allowed us to say that fertility is exponential if left unchecked. So if there was enough food to go around, production of the population would actually the reproduction of the population would take place much quicker. We'd be able to massively increase population in quite a short space of time. But agricultural production is a real limit to this because, of course, people need food to eat. So his analysis of historical population statistics suggested this capacity for the doubling of brute numbers every 25 years. And the conclusion really was that if you leave population growth unchecked, then it will exponentially grow, whereas production will not. And this means that population will spontaneously be checked by a comparatively lesser capacity for production. Production can only support the subsistence of smaller populations and a smaller population growth. So his problem was how to resolve social impoverishment related to this capacity of a country in a mercantile environment to only produce a certain amount of food. So he thought that population would naturally need to self-limit. His conclusion was that population growth would be continually checked by the comparatively lesser capacity for production. And that really is a euphemism, as I said at the start, for leaving families, poor families who have children that they can't afford to feed, to perish under conditions of famine. So what did Malthus have to say about responsible family behaviour? Well, he felt that there would be two checks on population growth. There'd be a positive check, as he calls it, in the lower class. And by that he meant that the family's inability to provide proper food for its children would spontaneously increase the mortality rate of children, with the effect that a large proportion of people, predominantly infants, would die in distressing circumstances. He thought the second type of check would be the preventative check on population that occurred in the middle class, where he meant the use of foresight by middle class families to lead them to avoid having further children, thereby decreasing the rate of population through choice rather than through untimely death. I've provided you with a citation there too. And so for the policy implications for Malthus were that families really should not be supported by poverty relief. He didn't want this to occur in a dramatic way. He felt that it should be poverty relief should be phased out slowly and gradually so that no one family should suffer. But he did think that the poverty relief should be reduced, if not abandoned. And this was a criticism of the old poor laws. The old poor laws were a distribution of poverty relief by the parishes in Britain in what was called outdoor relief, where the parishes provided relief without needing poor people to be housed in an institution on certain grounds. And Malthus's work informed, but Malthus thought that the provision of poor relief in the parishes was actually contributing to families who shouldn't be having children, having more children. It was incentivising the reproduction of children in ways that would aggravate poverty. So the implications was that Malthus's work informed the report of the Poor Law Commissioners in 1830, which led to the new poor laws. The new poor laws offered indoor relief, requiring that the poor be institutionalised in workhouses, and the poor relief that they received was in part a compensation for the work that they did. Malthus's views were more nuanced than simply defending the new poor laws, because he actually didn't support the new poor laws, but they became associated with the defence of the new poor laws because the report of the Poor Law Commissioners in 1830 referred explicitly to Malthus's essay on population in developing a case for the new poor laws and a criticism of the old poor laws. For a nuanced account of Malthus's work, I've put two texts there by Donald Winch and by Anthony Waterman. But in general, the idea was that families needed to be more responsible, and they were ultimately responsible for their own destitution and own distressing conditions. So we've now considered a number of problems that the classical period threw up for these political economists who were concerned with the relationship between society and economy. We saw that one concern was the problem of the monopolies of the mercantile class, and one was a problem of the power of the landowning class, a remnant of feudalism. We saw Smith respond to the first and Ricardo respond to the second. We also saw Malthus responding explicitly with the question of social impoverishment of the working class under conditions of improving agricultural production, noting that the government really should not be doing very much to intervene in when poverty arose. The government should let the population spontaneously limit itself within the constraints of production. A laissez-faire, or leave to make in French, a laissez-faire approach to the resolution of the social question of impoverishment. And this was a question that would arise again in the 19th century. So now to wrap up, opening this door to a critical consideration of the literature that we've looked at this week, and opening the door to the discussion of next week on Marxian political economy, let's turn now to the third element of our approach, where we consider, we provide a critical consideration of the response of the political economists. Let's ask those questions that Stilwell encourages us to ask and that we've refined for our own ends. Who gains? Who loses? And does it matter? Well, with Adam Smith, we can see that it's going to be those who benefit from opening up markets to global markets that are going to benefit. And this will eventually lead to the Industrial Revolution and the emergence of the capitalist class. So who gains? Well, it's the emerging bourgeois capitalist. We can't really criticise Adam Smith for not having anticipated this because he did not see the Industrial Revolution. But certainly the working class will lose. Who loses? The agrarian workers and their poor families in the Christian rural parishes, but also in an emerging industrial economy, the industrial workers in factories. And this will be something that Marxian political economy brings to our attention. This will be the period in which the social question becomes front and foremost of economists' theories from a whole range of ideological backgrounds. Poverty, the poverty of the working classes. And liberal, Marxian, socialist, eugenist, moralist and spiritualist approaches will all have very different ideas about how to resolve it. Polanyi in The Great Transformation described this utter destitution of the working classes as the grinding of men into masses. And this is what we will see when we come to the emerging industrialisation of society, of the British economy, particularly in the north, that will ensue from the changes to the economy that came about as a result of the institutionalisation of some of these ideas. Does it matter? Well, it does matter. If we want to have some sort of response to the immediacy of destitution and not let people starve, then it does matter. And so next week, we will look at Marxian political economy and see how Marx and Engels and other writers in a socialist tradition brought a new type of political economy, theorised a new way of thinking about the relationship between society and economies under emerging industrial conditions and no longer in agrarian economies. I hope you've enjoyed this consideration of classical political economy this week.